of crickets outside this house on Howard Street was interrupted by the 21st century bark of a cell phone. It was neither the first nor the last time that ubiquitous gadget would play a critical role in the story you're about to hear, but for Deborah Banks, this was the place where our story begins. Deborah knew the voice on the other end. It belonged to her future son-in-law, Keon Pittman. A few minutes earlier, he'd called while driving home from work to ask Deborah if she'd heard from her daughter Avis. Now, Keon sounded unhinged.
He was screaming and hollering. He said, "Y'all need to get over here." I said, "Keon, what's the matter?" I said, "Where is Avis? Y'all just need to get over here." And he hung up the phone.
With nothing else to go on, Deborah and her husband Fred pointed their car east toward Jackson, where their 27-year-old daughter and her 31-year-old fiancé had recently bought a home in the suburbs. They would have 55 miles to think about what it all meant.
All I could think of was that she had had a miscarriage. The whole while I was going over there, we were going over there. A miscarriage.
No doubt a miscarriage 5 months into Avis's pregnancy would be a bitter blow. But as Deborah and Fred drove east, they felt confident that if that was what Keon had been so upset about, he and Avis would survive and thrive. After all, they assured themselves Keon was a solid sort, and Avis, their middle daughter, was the family star.
All right, Avis, your day. You ready?
The first to graduate college.
Avis Marie Banks, cum laude.
Fred and Deborah Banks worked hard all their lives and managed to raise 3 daughters on his city street sweeper salary and whatever money Deborah earned from babysitting in their home.
Teach myself how to swing.
When the girls were grown and boys started coming around, Fred says plenty of knuckleheads showed up at his door. But he says few returned once he had a talk with them and laid down the law.
A couple of weeks, they was gone, you know. So yeah, I screened them real well.
Fred said that's why he was so relieved when Avis brought Keon Pittman home. College-educated, well-mannered, and hard-working, Fred says, Keon looked like a keeper.
He was the son we never had.
And before long, it would be official. After a 2-year courtship, the family was planning a February wedding. For Fred, it seemed like only yesterday he had given away his oldest daughter, and Avis was a bridesmaid. Now it was Avis's turn.
She was happy. Avis really was happy.
She was.
In fact, the whole family was planning to celebrate Avis and Keon's first Christmas in their new home in just a few weeks. As Fred turned the car into the subdivision where Avis lived, he expected to see the Christmas lights he'd helped Keon put on the roof. What he did not expect to see were the police cars out front.
When we got to the head of the island, the street, I never in my life felt like I felt when I found out what had happened. It's the hardest thing I ever did in my life.
Well, when I saw the yellow tape, I knew it was bad. You know, I knew. They didn't have to tell me, I knew.
Old Square Court in Ridgeland, Mississippi, just outside of Jackson, is the kind of suburban subdivision that seemed to spring up overnight during the latest housing boom. Neat, quiet, treeless places where for little or no money down, a young couple could grab a slice of the American dream, far from the gritty city streets. But for the people who live here, that sense of security evaporated on November 29th, 2006. At about 8:45 that Wednesday night, a neighbor living next door to Avis Banks and Keon Pittman called 911.
706 Old Square Court. What's going on there? He said somebody that killed his wife. He needed to respond to 706
time we get to this area here, it's obviously, you know, there's police cars on all sides of the road.
Ridgeland Police Lieutenant John Neal was the first detective on the scene that night.
There's people in the cul-de-sac standing out in front. The garage door's up. Of course, there were lights, Christmas lights up, street light at the end, so it was well lit.
Howling with grief, Keon Pittman sat in a patrol car, begging to get out and be with his fiancée.
We were trying to keep him separated from all of his neighbors. They'd started getting a little bit of information from him about where he had been, and at that time we just asked that he be taken away from the scene and up to the police department. He was a little hesitant about doing that. Didn't want to leave his fiancée here.
Inside the garage, Neal discovered a ghastly scene. 27-year-old Avis Banks lay on the floor, sprawled in a thickening pool of crimson. At a glance, the detective could see that Avis Banks had been ambushed by someone who definitely wanted her dead. Her car keys lay beside her hand, the day's mail still in her arms. There were multiple gunshot wounds and her throat had been slashed. Her pants had been pulled down, suggesting a sexual assault. And though the house had been ransacked, the detective quickly determined that was just window dressing.
This looked like it was a staged burglary.
A staged burglary.
Yeah, the back door was kicked in, and there was just some items inside the house that just didn't look right to the veteran officers that were there.
Why?
When we went into the master bedroom, every other drawer in the dresser drawers was open, instead of going through all of them. And
so every other one was open?
Right, every other drawer was open, which was strange. But in my 21 years, I've never worked a burglary scene where a suspect targeted items in a bathroom and they went through the bathroom cabinets, where you would keep your toilet bowl cleaners and various personal hygiene stuff.
Okay, so you knew something was up.
Right.
By 10 p.m., Fred and Deborah Banks were standing in the crowd outside their daughter's home, trying to get someone to tell them what was happening beyond the yellow tape.
We stood out there a long time until the coroner come out and told us that our daughter was deceased, that she died of a horrible death. Those exact words to you.
Murder is rare in Ridgeland, Mississippi. This was the first in more than a year. But there was one detail Detective Neal learned at the scene that night that made it all the more shocking.
The family has told us that she was 5 months pregnant, so you know it's kind of hits home to anybody with children.
In coming days, that detail would make headlines. But across town that night, in a small windowless room at police headquarters, another drama was just beginning to unfold.
These motherfuckers, I had something to do with this shit.
Keon Pittman, the young man who a short time earlier had been hysterically wailing over the murder of his future bride and unborn son, was now coolly using his cell phone to call and text with someone he called Babe.
And what am I going to do?
The last day of Avis Banks' life was just like every other day, until it wasn't. She had put in a full day at work at a local daycare center, used her cell phone to call her fiancé, and drove home. Once there, she picked up the mail, pulled into her garage, closed the door, and promptly died in a hail of bullets.
Extremely violent, passionate crime.
Detective John Neal says the pregnant woman was shot in the leg, chest, and head, and then stabbed within seconds of closing her garage door. The killer only missed once. The bullet passed through the garage door and into the empty street. Though Avis's pants had been partially pulled down, investigators determined that there had been no sexual assault on Avis Banks. That, they believed, was just the killer's attempt at misdirecting them. Multiple stab wounds, multiple gunshot wounds. What does that tell you as a police officer?
That, along with the staged burglary, we probably figured at that point it was somebody that knew Avis Banks or had a personal vendetta against her.
And probably the person who knew Avis best was someone who was right there on the scene at the time, a guy named Keon.
Keon had discovered her body. Detective Dillard.
The job of finding out just how much Keon Pittman might know about his fiancée's murder that night fell to Detective Frank Dillard. Initially, Keon had been taken in for questioning because he was the closest thing to a witness that investigators had.
Think some of your neighbors saw something? Say, the garage was died.
But as the hours of questioning dragged on past midnight, the grieving fiancé grew frustrated with his isolation from family and friends.
I don't even like being up here. I'd rather be back downstairs.
And began complaining about the way he was being treated by police.
I mean, y'all wouldn't let me use the restroom.
But you did use the restroom.
Yeah, after I paid.
And you did use the bathroom. Is that not correct? You did use the bathroom. Okay. So you can't say that you did not use the bathroom.
First impression of him when you met him?
Self-centered.
Self-centered?
Very much.
How'd you feel that?
In his speech, he kept referring to himself. You know, I, me. Just kept referring to himself.
So on the day that his fiancée is found murdered, his pregnant fiancée, he's saying I, and me?
That's correct, yes.
As a matter of routine, the police say they tested his hands for traces of gunpowder and photographed the bloody shirt he'd been wearing. But to Keon, it all seemed to add up to one thing. The police were treating him more like a suspect than a victim.
Just American way, huh? What's up? Guilty till proven innocent. Then why this?
So we have to find out what happened. I got tortured 3 or 4 times. I wasn't there.
Keon told the detective he'd discovered Avis's body after arriving home from basketball practice at Chastain Middle School, where he was a teacher and basketball coach. Did he seem distraught?
Yes, he went through an array of emotions. He was crying a little bit. He was laughing.
Did you find that odd to be laughing on a day like that?
Yes.
What was he laughing about?
Asked him some questions about his clothes, and he kind of chuckled about some shoes and shirts and stuff that he owned.
But when it came time to talk on the record about the murder of Avis Banks, Keon Pittman dug in.
Y'all have it. I did it. I'm involved or whatever. That's what it seemed like.
It went well until I asked him to sign this Miranda warning. And at that point, he declined.
I'm not going to sign that because you could easily go back and write in charges.
This allows us to ask you questions.
I'd rather have someone here because I really don't like the situation at all. And I feel, like I say, it's me by myself, and y'all keep me from everybody, and y'all saying that I'm innocent, but I'm upstairs, away from everybody, and y'all not letting nobody in. So that's not boding too well with me right now.
The next day, Keon Pittman hired a lawyer. As far as he was concerned, his days of talking to detectives were over.
I feel confident saying now that if Mr. Pittman was not a suspect already, because of his right to invoke the Fifth Amendment against self-incrimination, that there must be something out there that we really need to look at.
So the detectives started running down leads and learning all they could about Keon Pittman. In addition to his job as middle school teacher and coach, the detectives discovered that Keon also had a part-time job tending bar. But the more they learned, the more it seemed that Keon spent a lot of his time chasing women. How would you describe his lifestyle?
Free player. He wasn't too concerned about what happened under his own roof because he knew that Avis wasn't going to keep a very close watch on him. He was able to work this second job, to have girlfriends come by and visit him there without any kind of fear. He was able to go out of town on weekends with or without Avis and still carry on relationships outside of his relationship with Avis.
Though being a cad did not necessarily make Keon a killer, it did make him a strong suspect. What the detectives needed was evidence, a gun or knife, or a witness who could definitively connect Keon Pittman to the murder of Avis Banks. With that in mind, Detective Frank Dillard set out to talk with one of the girlfriends he'd heard about, a woman named Carla Hughes, who happened to teach at the same school where Keon taught.
I kept an open mind and was hoping that she would give me something on Keon, something I could use. Initially when we met, when she told me that they were just friends, she was crying hysterically. She was crying very hard.
She was crying?
Oh, yes. Once I got her to calm down and spoke with her, of course I asked her why was she crying, and she said that she was crying about what happened to Keon's fiance.
Hoping to give her space to calm down, Dillard invited the young woman back to the police station where they could chat in private. It was there that this murder investigation took the first of many surprising turns.
So I went over and started talking to him, and from that day on, we were talking.
In the days following the murder of Avis Banks, the investigating detectives focused like lasers on the usual suspect in cases such as this, the boyfriend.
He had made himself a suspect. He'd been named as a suspect by myself and by Frank.
After all, police had found Keon Pittman crouched over his fiance's body with blood on his clothes. And what's more, tests performed on his hands that night had come back positive for gunpowder residue.
We really thought, hey, this is our guy.
They'd also discovered that Pittman was a world-class womanizer. In fact, police now knew that instead of calling 911 after finding his fiance's body, Keon called another woman. Later that night, he even called her from police headquarters.
Well, what am I going to do?
Could that be the motive, they wondered? Did Keon Pittman kill his fiancée because he wanted to be with another woman? After 2 days of following leads, Detective Frank Dillard believed he had Keon Pittman's mystery woman, the possible motive for the killing, sitting right in front of him. But at first, she denied that she and Keon were lovers.
We were close friends.
Her name was Carla Hughes, and like Keon Pittman, she was a teacher at Chastain Middle School in Jackson, Mississippi. She told the detective that they had hit it off the first day they met.
I saw him and I heard him talking to another teacher, and he was talking about some things that I could relate to. So I went over and started talking to him, and from that day on, we were talking.
First impressions of Carla when you sat down with her?
I thought she was being deceitful with me,
What did she tell you that was untrue?
that her and Keon were just friends.
The detectives already suspected there was much more to it than that. Witnesses had told them that the two teachers behaved like a couple whenever they were together.
This wasn't your typical co-worker, two teachers that have similar interest in school. This was obviously something more.
Even their students knew about the relationship.
They were using students as their personal messengers, aside from the text messages that they were sending during the day.
They spent a lot of time at his second job. They spent time outside of the office at his first job, just so they had a relationship.
In time, detectives would discover even more about the relationship. They would learn that Keon had a key to Carla's apartment, and that the two of them had even managed to steal away a few weeks earlier for a romantic weekend in Memphis. But on this day, just 2 days after the murder of Keon's fiancée, Carla Hughes would only admit to a few acts of affection in public.
They see you together and they think certain things.
In
this case, they were right.
For more than an hour, Carla was pressed for details, but instead of dissolving into tears as she had when Detective Dillard first questioned her at Chastain Middle School,
Hello? This is Carla.
Carla was so calm she actually took cell phone calls while talking to a detective about murder.
Oh my God, oh my God. I was okay. I'll calm down. I'm on my way. She didn't want to. Hello?
Between cell phone interruptions, Carla sketched the outlines of a casual fling. She and Keon had a little harmless fun, she said. Nothing serious, nothing at all like the gossip the cops might have heard.
People may have saw us being affectionate towards each other, but at the most, they may have just saw a little kissing. But as far as just like this full-out blown romantic love affair, that's not what it was. It really wasn't. Because it wasn't a lot.
According to Carla, this was one of those special friendships. Carla even claimed that Avis Banks knew all about her and didn't seem to mind. In fact, Carla said Keon even let her keep her motorcycle in their garage for a while.
He would call her, like, for instance, if we went out to eat, me, him, and the other coaches, or sometimes just me and him, we would hang out. He would call her, and he'd be like, I'm with Carla, or whatever. So she knew about me.
To hear Carla tell it, it was all so innocent and evolved. Hardly the kind of thing that might lead to the bloody ambush of a pregnant woman.
Did you ever ask him to leave Avis?
No. I actually, I told him, what we have as a friendship is what we have. What y'all have is what y'all have. We never really just talked about him leaving. We never talked about him leaving her at all.
On the day of the murder, Carla told the detective that Keon Pittman stopped by her house at about 4:40 to temporarily store some groceries he'd picked up for Avis.
So he left at 5:10, said he was going to basketball practice. Then he called me, I'll say about 15, 20 maybe. And I told him I was just getting done working out. And I was about to head home to take a shower. And he said, okay, well, I'll be back after practice to pick up the groceries, before I go home.
At 7:50, Carla told the detective that Keon was back at her house.
He stayed about 45 minutes. He went home from enough time for him to leave home and leave my house and get home. He called me. I thought he was calling to say he made it home.
When she answered, Carla said Keon was screaming.
And I couldn't understand the first few things he said. He was just saying, oh my God, oh my God. And I'm like, what is wrong with you? What's going on? He's like, I need you to get over here. I need you to get over here. Something happened. Somebody hurt Avis. And I was like, huh?
It was all so shocking and sudden. All she knew was that Keon was beside himself with grief and that she needed to be there for him.
He was like, I need you to get over here. Somebody hurt Avis.
The crime, as far as Carla knew, was basically a burglary gone bad. That's what Keon had told her.
Keon said that he found her by the car. He said when he let the garage up, she was by the car. And he said, Carla, she must didn't make it in the house because she still had her purse on her shoulder or something. And she was holding some books or something.
Though Carla gave the detective a detailed accounting of Keon's movements on the night of the murder, he wasn't quite sure what to make of it all. The fact that she'd initially lied about the nature of her relationship with Keon still nagged at him.
What do you think, just hearing from what you've told me, from what I've told you, what do you think?
It's unfortunate. I think it is very, very unfortunate.
There seemed to be a brittle chill in that answer. So after having Carla write down her statement about the day Avis Banks died, Detective Dillard asked a question he had not intended to ask the girlfriend of his primary suspect.
You want to know?
No, I don't.
Do you have access to them?
4 days later, the question that almost was not asked was answered in the unlikeliest of ways. Two days after her murder, Avis Banks and the baby boy she'd been carrying were buried together in a family plot.
Hey, Avis, we back again?
Generations of the Banks family rest in peace in this Vicksburg, Mississippi churchyard. But on the day of Avis's funeral, there was no peace for those who gathered to mourn her. Their grief was now tinged with the growing suspicion that Avis's former fiancé, Keon Pittman, might have had a hand in her death. Avis's older sister even had a theory of her own.
She said, a man didn't do that to her sister. She said a woman did that. And it's probably some woman that he was fooling around with.
The suspicion that Keon may have been cheating on Avis was not without cause. A week earlier, when the family gathered in Houston for Thanksgiving, everyone had noticed that Keon seemed aloof and disengaged. He'd been on his cell phone constantly, either mumbling in hushed tones or taking the phone outside so that no one could hear.
He on the phone 24/7, all day, all night, in and out the house.
And at that time, too, I remember Avis was sitting across from him. And he walked by on his phone, he said hello, and I kind of noticed Avis kind of looked at him, kind of gave him a little look.
At the time, Keon told them he'd been speaking with his mother about a family matter. But now, they doubted that. They wondered, what if he had been cheating on Avis? What if he had been courting a mistress right under their noses. They say a text message found on Avis's phone after she died hinted that the relationship between Avis and Keon had hit a rough patch.
I'm doing everything I can to make it work, and it will work. But how would you feel if I was on the phone all night?
Whatever Keon may have been up to then, the family was in no mood to see a public display of grief from him now.
He was hollering. He was not crying. He was just hollering. He ain't showed tears like this here. No tears. No tears at all.
For Avis's older sister, that was the last straw.
She was sitting there, and Keon coming up there with all that hollering, and she just couldn't take it. She said, Keon, I'm gonna beat you. And before she could get to him, her husband grabbed her and picked her up.
As chairs scattered, other banksmen rose to confront Keon. But police officers who were on hand stepped in before anyone could actually get their hands on him.
They put a coat or something on Keon's head, and they escorted him out to his car.
Coincidentally, even as the grieving Banks family focused its anger on Keon Pittman at Avis's funeral, detectives back in Ridgeland were actually interviewing one of the women who'd been seeing Keon on the sly, 25-year-old Carla Hughes.
Are you two involved in each other?
Yes.
Detective Frank Dillard had initially hoped Carla would help him build a case against Keon. But instead, something about her demeanor had led him to ask her this.
You want to know?
No, I don't.
Do you have access to them?
No, I don't. I mean, my father has a lot of guns. He's a hunter. I don't have any.
2 days after the murder of Avis Banks, the detectives were no closer to making an arrest than they had been on the night her bullet-ridden body was found in her garage. They had an unfaithful boyfriend who'd acted suspiciously, but they didn't have a murder weapon. Then an amazing thing happened.
Frank got a phone call from one of the local attorneys just outside of Jackson that indicated to him in that phone call that he had some valuable piece of evidence that we think may be tied to that crime, and that they told him at that point that it was a .38 revolver.
Not only did the attorney turn over a gun, he also turned over a witness who knew who had that gun on the night of the murder.
His name is Patrick Nash, who's a cousin of Carla Hughes.
And what did he say?
According to him, she borrowed the gun for protection.
According to the cousin, Carla borrowed a fully loaded revolver 3 days before the murder and returned it empty, less than an hour after this encounter with Detective Dillard. Did you find that at all weird that a cousin would rat out their cousin like that?
Not in this particular case, because pretty much this whole family seem to be stand-up people, good people.
Once the cousin realized that Carla had been seeing the fiancé of that woman who'd been murdered in nearby Ridgeland, he got his father, Carla's uncle, involved.
There was actually some conversations between Patrick's father and Carla about that gun prior to bringing it to us. And I think one of the interviews that Mr. Nash gave to us, he indicated that when he asked Carla about the gun and asked her point blank, it's just the gun that was used in that crime up there. And instead of getting a verbal answer from her, she just hung her head down.
Oh, well, that's big.
And I think at that point they realized they didn't want any part of this. They were going to do what they had to do to do the right thing.
If true, it was clear that Carla Hughes had lied about not having had access to a gun on the night Avis Banks was murdered. Now, detectives wanted to know what else she might be lying about.
Is there more to this than what you're telling?
No.
Carla Hughes may not have had much to say to police, but now the detectives had a gun that could be traced to Carla. If ballistic tests tied that gun to the murder of Avis Banks and her unborn child, Carla Hughes would have a lot of explaining to do. For investigators, the murder of Avis Banks had all the earmarks of a classic death by boyfriend.
We don't like him. We don't like his lifestyle. We don't like what he caused Avis and Avis's family.
Call it gut instinct, but detectives felt a man who cheats on his pregnant girlfriend, calls his mistress instead of calling 911 after he finds her body, tests positive for gunpowder residue at the police department, and then abruptly stops cooperating with the cops, might be guilty of something.
We've gotten to a critical point in this to where we've got some information that we're trying to verify, and due to that information we are receiving, we're not going to make any more comments on the case at this time.
And yet, in spite of all that, the detectives still didn't feel they had the kind of evidence that would hold up in court if they actually arrested Keon Pittman and charged him with murder. For instance, though the gunpowder residue found on his hands the night Avis Banks died might look incriminating, gunpowder residue is not the same as gunpowder burn. Burns would come from firing a weapon. Residue could theoretically have rubbed off on Keon's hands when he cradled Avis's body. And regardless of how suspiciously he had acted, Keon Pittman appeared to have a rock-solid alibi.
We know Keon is at basketball practice some 12, 15 miles away, and we have eyewitnesses that put him at the basketball practice at the time of the murder.
Still, up until relatives of one of his girlfriends surfaced with a potential murder weapon, Keon Pittman was suspect number 1, 2, and 3. The gun changed everything.
We sent it off to have ballistic tests done, and of course the results came back as a positive match.
With ballistic tests showing that the murder weapon had been in Carla's possession on the night of the murder, detectives called her in for a second round of questioning.
You're right to remain silent.
But this time, Carla brought a lawyer with her.
I'll tell you when to ask and when not to ask.
This was not just any lawyer. This attorney happened to be Johnny Walls, an influential state senator from Carla's hometown of Greenville, Mississippi, and a family friend.
I met Carla through her parents, and she was just a very popular young lady.
Okay, so you want to terminate the interview? Yeah. All right, hold on for a second. Talk to the supervisor.
Normally, a curtain of privacy is drawn at this point. An arrest is made and everybody prepares for trial. But not in this case.
Sir, can I have a word with you, please?
In this case, the detective pulls the attorney aside and encourages him to coax a confession from Carla. As the hidden camera continues to roll, it captures something extremely rare. A private conversation between a lawyer and his client at a critical moment.
That is him. And I don't understand why you trying to protect him.
Why is it that I gotta be trying to protect him? I mean, why not?
They think you know something.
As police stand outside the door, Carla Hughes and her lawyer, Johnny Walls, cut to the heart of the matter.
What did they charge me with tonight?
They charged you with accessory. He's accessory after the fact.
Johnny Walls tells his client that the police think they have a strong case against her. They have a murder weapon and a witness who happens to be a cousin of hers, who will say that she borrowed the gun shortly before the murder and returned it 2 days after.
He said, Patrick, no, Jim didn't tell me that Patrick was safe. He said when you gave it all back to him, you cried. You remember that?
So I cried.
He said you cried.
But in spite of that incriminating piece of evidence, Johnny Walls tells his client that the detective has hinted that he wants to make a deal.
You stopped him from charging you if you put the finger on him. And he can't understand why you won't do that. He said she must be in love with this cat. I said, well, I don't know. If she is.
It's not that. I mean, if I wasn't there when he did it, then I just wasn't there when he did it. I can't make myself say he did it. I just know when he wasn't with me.
Well, you know, I'm a criminal lawyer. I represented people who I know committed the crimes. And if they can do anything to help themselves out, they're gonna come up with it. She never would say that there was anything about him that she knew. You know, at this point, you have to decide that you want to make any step that's going to implicate him. Right? Yeah. Okay. You don't want to make a step that's going to implicate yourself. Yeah. Okay. That's the answer.
With Carla unable or unwilling to tell either her lawyer or police anything that might implicate Keon, she was immediately charged as an accessory in the murders of Avis Banks and her unborn baby.
Carla, did you kill Avis Banks?
Come on.
Did either Carla or Keon have any sort of criminal background, any history, any criminal history?
Neither one.
With Carla Hughes in jail, detectives were certain it would only be a matter of time before she would implicate Keon Pittman. Because the more they learned about Carla Hughes, the harder it was to imagine her as a cold-blooded killer.
Hello, I'm Carla Hughes, and I'm from Greenville.
They were alike in many ways, both born and raised in Mississippi River towns, both blessed with a potent blend of beauty and brains, and both were their father's pride and joy.
She the kind of daughter that you would draw up. Wouldn't change a thing with Avis. She was daddy's girl.
Well, I guess I always wanted a son. I guess she was my son. So, I mean, you know, she and I are real close.
And yet, in spite of all that, the daughters of Carl Hughes and Fred Banks might never have crossed paths had they not been fatefully attracted to the same man, Keon Pittman. Now, Fred's daughter was dead, and Carl's was accused of murder.
Hello. Hey, Dad. Okay. I'm all right.
Immediately after her arrest, Detective Frank Dillard asked Carla's father, Carl, to come in and talk about his daughter.
I honestly don't believe she did it. But I'm dead.
After telling the detective all he knew about his daughter's involvement with Keon Pittman,
He was with Carla one day.
the stress of it all got the better of him.
So how's this newspapers?
These are not strong. They all were about me. That's my baby. You everybody wanted her son. And I didn't want she was my son. And that's part of my life. I mean, I did everything together. Everything. That's why I had. That's what makes it so hard for me.
Carla had come into the lives of Carl and Linda Hughes when a relative who already had too many mouths to feed offered up her new infant for adoption.
When we looked at her, we fell in love with her.
Did you have children?
No.
So she was your one and only? One and only. Blessed with doting parents who also happened to be school teachers, Carla was encouraged from an early age to excel at everything.
My name is Carla Hughes. I'm running for clerk because I feel that I will make Solomon Junior High a better place.
She played tennis, she played soccer, she was a cheerleader, she tried to play basketball, she was a majorette dancer in the band, she was in the Key Club, student council.
That's exhausting.
If it came up, okay.
She was in it?
She was in it.
By the time Carla reached high school, she was clearly Greenville's golden girl.
Hello, I'm Carla Hughes and I'm from Greenville.
A beauty queen who competed in Mississippi's National Teen and Miss Teenage America pageants.
Carla's hobbies include dancing, singing, and horseback riding.
Carla was also an honor student on the Mayor's Youth Council and a page in the Mississippi State Senate.
She's just able to accomplish anything, you know, if she was with her daddy, or whatever his hobbies were, she was able to tap into daddy.
She and I were horse persons. She loved the horse.
Always daddy's girl, Carla learned to ride and show the Tennessee walking horses that her father Carl trained. In 1995, at the age of 14, she was crowned Mississippi State Champion and went on to finish 6th in the world competition. And her record of accomplishment did not stop there.
She just said she wanted to be a teacher like you are, Daddy.
Collegiate honors, a master's degree, and work toward a doctorate had laid the groundwork for a stellar career in education. In short, her life seemed charmed. Not even a failed romance that left her with a 2-year-old son to raise had sidetracked her. Then along came Keon Pittman. 4 months after meeting him, Greenville's golden girl was in deep trouble. Detectives had not only put a murder weapon in her hands, they'd also found a pair of blood-flecked shoes in her townhouse that had a tread pattern that matched a footprint left on a back door at the murder scene. Overnight, that discovery caused the original accessory after the fact charge to be upgraded to first-degree murder.
Are you guilty of this?
When you heard that news, Carl, what did you think?
I mean, it just did something to me.
He's had a hard time dealing with it, and
because you know your daughter.
yes.
Has she ever done anything violent before?
No. She wouldn't even whoop a horse.
Really?
Well, sometimes you have to get the horse's attention, and she just
couldn't do it.
She wouldn't do it.
Because the murder was violent.
The murder was violent.
Multiple gunshots, multiple stab wounds, and they say that they've got some evidence against your daughter, a gun that they say the bullets came from. How do you explain that?
I can't explain that.
Why did she have a gun in her house, Linda?
She had it for protection, and her apartment had been broken into, I think, a couple of times.
So she was always a little uneasy.
Yeah.
I fixed the door once at the back of the apartment where it looked like somebody had tried to get in.
So the gun was there, and the bullets from the scene are connected to that gun. If not Carla, then who?
Who else had access?
Who else?
Keon.
Even the police suspected Keon, but the evidence, a gun and a pair of blood-speckled shoes, pointed to Carla Hughes. Nothing had been discovered so far that implicated Keon Pittman.
He has stayed on our radar during this entire process. The problems that we run into, and I don't want to necessarily label them as problems, but we haven't had the evidence to convict Keon on anything.
Still, there was one witness out there who'd apparently seen it all, a tall, silent type whose story would play a critical role in this case. Dominating the landscape and documenting every casual drive-by conversation.
Everybody has a cell phone these days. Most folks can't live without them. I believe that most folks probably have no idea of the records and the type of records that cell phone companies keep.
Michael Guest got a good feel for that when it became his job to prosecute Carla Hughes for the 2006 murders of Avis Banks and her unborn child.
I think the two most important pieces of evidence that we had were the cell tower records and the gun itself.
Witnesses could link the murder weapon to Carla Hughes, and the prosecutor hoped a jury would buy his theory that Carla killed Avis in a jealous rage because she wanted Keon Pittman all to herself. But it was the story these towers told that would ultimately reveal what happened on the night Avis Banks died.
You're building a timeline based on the cell phone record of Avis Banks, the cell phone records of Keon Pittman, and the cell phone records of Carla Hughes. In our particular case, the cell tower records not only placed Miss Hughes there in the area where the crime occurred, but it also placed Mr. Pittman miles away across town at basketball practice.
According to that timeline, Avis Banks left her job at the daycare at 5:10. She would have been about 10 minutes from home at 5:36 when she called Keon Pittman at basketball practice to ask about dinner plans. That was to be the last phone call Avis Banks would ever make. Immediately after hanging up the phone from Avis, phone records show Keon called Carla. That call bounced off this tower, which is roughly a quarter mile from the house Keon shared with Avis.
The cell tower records showed that Miss Hughes was in the area. There was one call that occurred, I believe, at 5:37, another at roughly 6:04, 6:05. So within a 30-minute period of time, we can place her in the vicinity of the crime.
The detectives believed Avis Banks was murdered between 5:50 and 6 p.m. If Carla was near the house when Keon called her at 5:37, and Carla was calling Keon from that same area at 6:05, that would seem to suggest that the two middle school teachers were possibly partners in murder.
We think that he's had conversations with Carla prior to coming home that night to where she indicated to him what she had done, probably in an attempt for the two of them to be together.
One of those conversations may well have taken place here at Carla's townhouse. This is where Carla said Keon Pittman came after basketball practice to pick up some groceries he dropped off earlier. According to Carla, he spent about 45 minutes and left at 8:30. At 8:31, cell records show he was on the phone again, this time not to Avis to say he was headed home, but to Avis's mother, Deborah, in Vicksburg.
Keon made the phone call to Deborah Banks while he was en route home, asking if she had heard from Avis, which, according to Deborah, is just extremely unusual and just out of character for Keon. So I feel like certainly that he knew at that point.
10 minutes later, police say Keon Pittman turned onto a street, opening his automatic garage door as he drove. Stopping in front of the house and leaving the car door open and engine running, Keon had told police he rushed directly to the garage where his fiancée lay dead because he had a feeling that something was wrong.
There were lots of red flags flapping all over this case that are pointing to him. Why wasn't he charged as an accessory?
We didn't want to bring Keon in as a suspect and officially charge him with anything without having something that's clear cut that we knew was a prosecutable case.
The key to prosecuting Keon, they felt, was Carla Hughes. But she wasn't talking. Carla Hughes wanted no part of a plea deal. She wanted an acquittal, and she was willing to wait years, if need be, for the chance to face a jury that could give her that. The Tennessee walking horses Carla Hughes used to ride and show are known for their high-stepping gait, gentle nature, and endurance. All traits that Carla herself seemed to personify.
Carla Hughes.
As a teenager, she'd been a model of good breeding both on stage and off. Now, as a young woman, she'd endured nearly 3 years in jail while awaiting trial for the double murder of her rival, Avis Banks, and Avis's unborn child. Though she potentially faced the death penalty if convicted, Carla Hughes had repeatedly rebuffed inducements to implicate her former lover and Avis's former fiancé, Keon Pittman.
Yeah, you point your finger at him. They go back away from you. Try to say that he's the one.
On Valentine's Day 2008, little more than a year after the murder, the detective sent Carla a special Valentine's message via her attorney, Johnny Walls. It was a copy of a marriage certificate that showed Keon had married someone else and left the state. They'd hoped that sentimental bombshell might prompt a confession, but they were disappointed. Walls says Carla's only response was, "I'm not surprised."
I'm informed by the bailiff the jury is ready. Let's bring them in.
In October 2009, the former lovers met again. This time, Carla would be on trial for her life, and Keon's secret life would be laid bare for all to see.
Myself and Senator Walls, we wore dual hats. We were both prosecuting and defending. We knew that, the defense was going to have to try to shift the blame off of Carla Hughes. And we knew that the person that they were going to shift that blame onto was, in fact, Keon Pittman.
Avis Banks, the victim in this case, was 27 years old at the time of her death.
From the outset, prosecutors seemed to have ample evidence to prove the former beauty queen was a killer.
There will be but one verdict which you can reach. And that verdict will be that this defendant, Carla Hughes, is in fact guilty of capital murder in the death of Avis Banks.
Not only did they have witnesses who would say Carla had the murder weapon in her possession.
Do you become concerned that this gun may have been used in a crime?
Well, yes, I felt uneasy.
They also had lab tests that revealed Avis Banks's blood was found on a pair of shoes found in Carla's closet.
The tread pattern of those shoes matches the tread pattern that officers had photographed and documented and observed on the rear door of Avis Banks' residence.
And then there were the cell phone records. With graphs, charts, and expert testimony, the prosecution could put Carla Hughes in close proximity to the murder scene.
But the records of Carla Hughes show that at 5:37 p.m. and then again at, I believe, 6:05 p.m., that she is either making or receiving 2 phone calls. And that those calls both are bouncing off a tower located less than a quarter of a mile from the residence where Avis Banks was killed.
At the same time, cell records seem to provide a convincing alibi for Keon Pittman, the ex-boyfriend Carla's defense team hoped to implicate.
It would have been impossible for him to have left basketball practice, gone home, committed the murder, and then returned to basketball practice.
It seemed like a solid case, but with 9 women on the jury, prosecutors were well aware that their biggest problem could be their key witness, Keon Pittman.
Keon Pittman, the fiancé of Avis Banks, had not been faithful to Avis during the course of their engagement, that he had been involved with relationships with other women, and at the time of the crime that he was involved in a romantic relationship with the defendant, Carla Hughes.
The dicey job of managing Keon's testimony fell to veteran assistant prosecutor John Empfinger.
Keon Pittman's story is essential to the case. His relationship with Avis Banks, his relationship with Carla Hughes, that's the sum and total of this case. And so he had to tell the story because we couldn't get it from anywhere else.
My name is Keon Pittman.
The man who had not spoken to police since the night of his fiancee's murder 3 years earlier now had a story to tell and a packed courtroom hanging on every word.
Carla Hughes, do you see her in this courtroom?
Yes.
Will you point to her, please?
Keon was saying, someone has killed Avis.
We're going to classify him as a suspect.
Keon Pittman has not been charged.
Keon Pittman claimed
he had been involved with relationships with other women.
Keon was a bona fide woman.
Nearly 3 years after the murder of his fiancée, Avis Banks, Keon Pittman brought his battered reputation into a crowded Mississippi courtroom and took the stand as the chief witness for the prosecution against his former lover, Carla Hughes.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you will give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Have a seat, please.
Am I concerned when you have a witness on the stand that's not necessarily a lovable fellow? Then yeah, we are, but the only thing that I can hope for is that he's telling the truth and that the jury believes that this is the truth that he's telling. You're not trying to hide it. Warts and all, this is it.
From the very beginning, Keon Pittman appeared to be on the verge of an emotional meltdown. But in this room, he would find little sympathy.
He didn't cry. He faked it.
Were they real tears?
I don't know whether he was crying or was not crying.
He rubbed his eye for to make him red. That boy ain't crying.
With Carla Hughes sitting just a few feet away, Keon Pittman recounted how their relationship had begun in August 2006 as a friendship between colleagues at Chastain Middle School. Then he said it quickly blossomed into a torrid affair worthy of Hollywood.
It started moving pretty fast.
But the movie scenes Keon described seemed more like Fatal Attraction than love story.
Were you infatuated with Miss Hughes?
Yes.
What did you think was going on? What did you think was happening?
A sexual adventure.
According to Keon Pittman, the relationship was all about sex. In addition to frequent liaisons at her townhouse, Keon said they'd even managed a romantic weekend in Memphis when he'd told Avis he was helping a friend move.
Were you going to leave Avis Banks for Carla Hughes, or how did you view the long-term prospects for your relationship with Carla Hughes?
There was no long-term. It was sexual, caught up in the moment. Speaking of myself, there never was a long-term plan with Carla.
But before long, Keon said he noticed that Carla was taking their sexual romps a little too seriously. He said she insisted he meet her parents and introduced him to friends as her future husband. At one point, he said she even told him she was pregnant.
She expected or wanted me to pretty much leave Avis and come with her. She wanted that to be over with and come with her and be with her and take care of the supposed baby that she had.
Though that pregnancy turned out to be a false alarm, Keon told the court that Carla started stalking him in Avis and even threatened to confront Avis face to face.
She got pissed. She was like, you know what? I want to talk to Avis. I'm going, and she got in a vehicle. She headed towards my house.
Following in his own car, Keon says he called Carla on his cell phone and told her he would call the cops if she ever went near his fiancée.
After that, she just went the other way. I'm not sure where she went, but she didn't come to the house that night.
A close call, to be sure, but according to Keon, no matter how often he told Carla he would never leave Avis, she would not let up. On the weekend after Thanksgiving that year, Keon told the court that Carla had rented a hotel room in Picayune, Mississippi, where he and Avis were visiting his mother. Through text messages, Keon says she asked him to leave Avis at his mother's house and meet up with her at a restaurant outside of town. Incredibly, he did.
What was the nature of your visit or your conversation with Miss Hughes at that point in time?
Well, she got upset because I would stay out late at that point in time, or I wouldn't show her around the sites or whatever it was. And we did, get into it. She was pissed about that.
How did that visit end?
It ended on a bad note.
Bad, but not bad enough for either of them to terminate the affair. 4 days later, Keon was still seeing Carla Hughes, and his fiancée, Avis Banks, was dead.
Did you inflict those wounds on Avis Banks?
No, sir.
Did you kill her?
No, sir.
Did you kill your unborn child?
No, sir.
Do you know who did?
No, sir.
This was where the delicate, high-wire work began. Prosecutor John Empfinger needed his star witness to implicate Carla Hughes, but avoid implicating himself by hinting that he knew anything about the murder either before or after it happened.
Do you feel any responsibility for her death?
Yes.
Tell me how.
If I would have stayed faithful to who I was with, if I had been thinking poorly, making bad choices, or made a bad choice to sleep around and flirt with other women, this chain of events would have never taken place.
And you don't have any personal knowledge about who may have killed Avis, do you?
No.
The only information that you have or that you know is things that you've read in the media or that you may have heard during the course of the investigation of the case. Is that correct?
Yes.
I'm convinced that he did not know about it beforehand. I am convinced that when he left Carla Hughes' apartment that night, that he knew something was wrong. His explanation to me is he's never been able to not contact Avis.
Carla Hughes' attorney, Johnny Walls, was considerably less inclined to give Keon Pittman the benefit of the doubt when his turn came to offer a defense.
The evidence in this case is going to show you that Keon Pittman was their suspect, and he still should be their suspect. And the evidence is going to show you that you should let Carla Hughes go home. That one's Carla's. And that's the one she did all the winning on.
For 3 years, while his only child sat in jail awaiting trial for murder, Carl Hughes kept the faith. Her ribbons and trophies might be vanishing beneath blankets of dust, but her father's pride remained untarnished.
Still proud of her.
Carl felt it in his bones. His little girl was not, could never have been, the person prosecutors now portrayed as a cold-blooded killer. With her former lover now married to someone else, Carl could see only one explanation for Carla's refusal to implicate him.
I don't think she knows anything. I honestly don't think she knows
Really?
anything. Because if she knew, she would have told something, especially after he gets married. If there's anything, she doesn't know anything. So what could she tell?
But Carla's attorney, Johnny Walls, knew he had to tell the jury something, an alternative theory that might convince at least one juror that someone other than Carla Hughes killed Avis Banks.
Another reasonable hypothesis is that that boyfriend could have killed his fiancée. And if you think that's reasonable, then your duty is to find her not guilty.
With that in mind, the defense attorney became a prosecutor and set his sights on Keon Pittman.
My prosecution did not have to show the jury beyond a reasonable doubt that Keon did it. My prosecution was to show the jury that there's another theory with this evidence. Evidence in this case is going to show you that Keon Pittman is the one that had the opportunity, had the ability, and had the motive.
It was all a setup, Walls told the jury. Keon had a key to Carla's apartment. Keon knew Carla kept her cousin's gun in her nightstand. Keon knew Carla had a pair of shoes that fit him because he'd borrowed them in the past. And most importantly, he said, Keon had a fiancée he wanted to get rid of.
Keon was a bona fide womanizer and that he did not want this child.
According to Walls, Keon Pittman must have planted incriminating evidence, the gun and a pair of blood-flecked shoes, in Carla's townhouse after the murder, because police found no trace of her at the scene of the crime.
Have you found any evidence, fingerprints or otherwise, that places Carla Hughes in that house?
No, sir.
In fact, Walls argued that a police dog had failed to turn up even the scent of a stranger at the murder scene. On the other hand, the lawyer accused the police of dropping the ball when they had Keon Pittman in the police station that night.
If you really consider him a suspect, why not check his clothes for gunpowder residue? They didn't check his clothes. Checked his hands, though. And they found gunpowder particles on his hands. Well, if they found them on his hand, why not go further and check his clothes? They didn't, okay? If they did, they never showed a report to us.
The cell phone records that prosecutors said put Carla in the area, Walls said amounted to nothing. She lived less than 4 miles from the murder scene and happened to be out running errands that night.
They could not even put her on the street. With the cell phone evidence, they could put her in the zone. But the zone is a 2.5-mile radius.
On the stand, Keon had claimed that he rushed home from Carla's house that night because he'd become concerned about not hearing from Avis while he was at basketball practice.
I kept going home. I picked up my pace, trying to get home because it wasn't like her not to call.
Johnny Walls was skeptical. Cell phone records showed that Keon had called Avis's cell twice that day, once at lunchtime and once again just before he arrived home and found her body.
Isn't it true that you only called your fiancée twice that day?
Yes.
Why so few calls to Avis if he'd been concerned about her? Walls argued that Keon clearly had time to call because cell records showed dozens of calls and text messages he'd made to others during basketball practice that night. Besides his calls to Carla, Walls argued, Keon was also busy flirting with another woman, a Bridget Matlock, the mother of one of his players.
Wasn't Bridget Matlock present at practice?
Yes.
And didn't you spend time texting her on the 29th?
Yes.
While you were at practice?
Yes.
What do you call that?
Texting.
Were you texting her about getting with her?
I probably did.
Probably or did?
Probably did. I don't remember what the texts were.
Didn't you text Bridget or call Bridget on the 29th at least 40 times during the day?
I probably called her. I don't know about 40 times.
As for Keon's claim that Carla had stalked him, Johnny Walls said it was Keon who had pursued Carla, Keon who had constantly called her. And it was Keon who'd brazenly parked his mistress's motorcycle right under Avis's nose in his garage.
I told her it was a buddy of mine. I thought it was a buddy. Sexual buddy.
Oh, okay. Well, did you tell your future wife that that motorcycle belongs to a sex partner that I'm having sex with?
No, I didn't.
When you told her that the motorcycle was for a buddy, didn't you lie?
I covered it up. If you ask me if I ever told a lie, or whatever, yes, I have told lies before.
So you deceived her?
Yes.
It was a withering assault on Keon Pittman's character. Johnny Walls even produced a witness who claimed Keon had left basketball practice early, suggesting that Keon could have possibly driven home and killed Avis himself. But after 2 days on the stand, the most important part of Keon's story, his alibi, still stood.
Counsel asked you a number of times what would have kept you from standing in that door when Avis got home from work and doing this to Avis. Okay? Between 5:45 and 6:15. Where were you?
At basketball practice.
In the end, believing that he'd done all he could to create a reasonable doubt, the attorney decided not to put his client on the stand.
I did not want to put Carl on the stand and let the state make its whole case lambasting and beating her up on the stand about any kind of any matters that may not look good to the jury. And you know, if you're a single woman and you're messing around with a guy that's supposed to be engaged, women on the jury may not take too kindly to that.
And so after 6 days of testimony, the jury of 9 women and 3 men retired to consider the fate of Carla Hughes.
First thing, I want to compliment the lawyers on a well-tried case.
If convicted of a double homicide, she would face either a life sentence or death. If acquitted, the family of Avis Banks would be left wondering who killed Avis. And yet, in spite of the stakes, 2 families linked by tragedy had managed over the years since the murder to rise above rancor and forge an unlikely bond.
Right after it happened, they wouldn't speak.
You know, and we sitting over there, they sitting over here, so they think we angry.
But after we started going to those hearings and those different little things, then he started to get a little bit more friendly and a little bit more friendly.
As the trial went on, we started talking. You know, real nice people in our family.
When the prosecutor was doing his closing arguments, Mrs. Banks became real upset. As she left the courtroom, I left and went outside and I prayed with her, prayed for her. And I feel her pain. I do, I feel her pain.
It took the jury 8 hours to reach a decision.
All right, the court, having reviewed the verdicts, if the defendant would please rise. If the defendant would please rise.
There had been many times in her life when Carla Hughes had stood before an audience waiting to be judged. But this time there was more than a tiara, scholarship money, or bouquet at stake. This time it was her life.
We, the jury, find the defendant, Carla Hughes, guilty of capital murder as charged in count 1 of the indictment. Guilty of capital murder as charged in count 2 of the indictment.
And this time, her composure cracked under the weight of it all. In that moment, Fred Banks silently pointed to the sky and acknowledged the daughter he believed was watching from on high. A burden had been lifted.
It looked like to me all the hatred just left my body. No, I mean, I told my wife, I say, something happened to me. It seemed like I was born again. I don't know. It was a wonderful feeling.
The shadow came from me.
Mm-hmm.
It just said, whew.
Yeah.
A shadow came from me. And it was all right.
Across the aisle, a shadow of disbelief settled over 2 parents who'd made raising the perfect daughter their life's work.
I couldn't believe it. I just couldn't believe it. But I guess the hardest part was when they would take her away. And she said, "Daddy, help me. And there's nothing I can do." That's probably the hardest part of it.
You want to help your little girl, I know.
I did, but there's nothing I can do.
Immediately after the court recessed, attention turned to the penalty phase, where prosecutors were prepared to argue that Carla Hughes pay for the death of Avis Banks with her life.
The thing about the case that bothered me was the fact that Miss Banks was pregnant. She was 5 months pregnant. She had done nothing to Carla Hughes. And then for her to be killed in the manner in which she was killed, I believe that this was a case that death needed to be an option for the jury.
She takes a knife out and she stabs her. Boom, boom, boom.
But while the prosecution focused on the brutal death of Avis Banks, the defense wanted the jury to hear about the life of Carla Hughes.
We received her when she was 6 weeks old. My cousin was in distress with other children, and she was not able to afford to take care of all of the children. And as soon as the two of us walked in that room and looked at that beautiful child, we knew we had to take her and raise her in the way that the Lord would have us to do.
With the help of a hastily assembled cast of character witnesses, Johnny Walls told the story of how that little girl had gone from having an uncertain future to a bright and shining one.
She's not just a client. Carla's my hero.
Then the lawyer, senator, and family friend pleaded for her life.
You should want her to live, so that maybe while she's there, she can help somebody like she's always done. So I ask you to spare her life, because when you kill her, there's nothing you can do to bring her back. And if it's later determined that somebody else committed this crime, you won't be able to correct that.
After a 1-hour deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom one last time.
As to count one, sentence is, we the jury find that the defendant should be sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. As to count two, life imprisonment without parole.
At 28, Greenville, Mississippi's golden girl, the prodigy who'd once seemed destined for greatness, now faced a grim future, the reality that the rest of her life would be spent behind bars.
We'll stand adjourned.
It was then, when the courtroom was filled with the finality of such monumental waste, that a rare moment of grace shone through. Two fathers who'd invested all they had in their daughters consoled each other and said goodbye.
I saw me and him. The verdict came and I walked out. He just happened to be coming out too. And I grabbed his hand to shake his hand. I could see he was trying to embrace me, so I embraced him.
And he said we both lost. Basically, it's what he meant. He lost a daughter and I'm finna lose one. And he said, I'm praying for you. And I told him the same, and we kind of hugged, and he walked off.
The man at the center of the case that brought Carl Hughes and Fred Banks together in that courtroom has now moved on and built a new life for himself 1,000 miles away. But detectives John Neal and Frank Dillard say that even though Keon Pittman was never charged in the murder of Avis Banks, he is still on their radar.
You got her to commit this murder.
And still someone they'd like to talk to.
We know without a shadow of a doubt that we have the person in jail serving a life term who killed Avis Banks. We're absolutely confident in that, 100%. Our angle on Keon Pittman is some type of an accessory.
That he may have manipulated her or something.
Aided her in setting it up, or at the very least knew before he got to the house that she had been murdered.
Dateline tried to reach Keon Pittman for comment for this story at his home in Michigan, but he did not return our calls.
We're hoping that Carla wants to talk to us at some point in time. We think that she's the one that holds the key to if Keon was involved. And it may be that she drops another bombshell on us and he wasn't involved in any way.
That, it would seem, is wishful thinking.
That is one of the biggest or the biggest misconception about my case, that I know something that I could tell the police.
In a phone interview from the prison where she is currently serving her life sentence, Carla Hughes told me She had never met Avis Banks and knows nothing about her murder.
I have a 5-year-old son who was 2 at the time, and if there was anything that I could have told the police, you can believe that I would have told them from day one. I did not know anything about it, and I didn't participate in it. I was ultimately framed and used, and that's all I do know. That's all I could tell the police.
Who's framing you and using you?
Whoever killed Avis Banks.
Do you know who that person is?
I don't. I wish I did, so that I could be at home with my family.
Though Carla Hughes is currently appealing her conviction, Deborah Banks says she is confident that Carla and the young man who almost became her son-in-law, Keon Pittman, will never be able to escape her daughter's gaze.
Every time him and Carla close their eyes, they see Avis. He see her. He see her.